I'm really glad to be here. As Mandy was saying, been, I'm a therapist. I work with families. I work with couples, marriage, counseling, but I've been doing something else for a much longer period of time, and that's I've been working in the addiction field for about 20 years now. And I should say that in addition to the work I've done, I've also done a lot of research. Now, before I became a counselor, I did a lot of research on addiction, meaning that I found out how addiction affects me. I began using cocaine in my late teens. I'd smoked a little pot and done a little alcohol, but I hadn't really been attracted or really felt like I needed to use drugs for any reason at that point, even though later on I would find out that there are things that happened in my childhood that definitely would portray or at least point that there was something missing in my life. One of the themes that we've heard today, and it's such an important one, is about connection. And I didn't understand at that point that there were a lot of things going on in my life where I was disconnected. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the first time I did cocaine. I think I was 17 or 18 years old, and I went over to a friend's house to visit. We were listening to some music, probably something like Emerson, Lake and Palmer back then. And he said, "Hey, you want to try this?" And I said, yeah, okay, I will. What is it? You notice I said, yes, I will, before I even asked what it was, which is an indicator of something, missing, or, I'm already maybe a little bit wired for taking some risks in life. But he said, it's cocaine. And so he gave me a little tiny bit, a very small amount, and I did it, and something clicked in me in that moment. And I felt normal, what I considered normal, or at least I hadn't felt that way before. As I told you, I'd smoked pot, I drank a little bit of beer, and in fact, to be honest with you, I'd probably done acid 100 times before that. Maybe 200, I don't know a lot, but I'd pretty much stopped that, and I'd stopped smoking pot, and beginning more towards living a different life. But something clicked with me with the cocaine, and I felt different. And it filled something in me that I guess I thought had been missing. Now, it didn't start there. I mean, as far as abusing cocaine or becoming addicted to it, it was a few years later when I moved out west. I'm from Connecticut originally, but I moved out to Idaho, went to college, spent a couple years there, and I met someone else that was using cocaine at the time, and I started using it more regularly, maybe on weekends, and then before I knew it, I was using it 3 or 4 times a week. In fact, all the money I made was beginning to go to cocaine. One of the people I lived with actually sold cocaine, so that made it a little bit more feasible to be able to use it. And that went on and off, periods of binge using for about 20 years. Literally, I would go for maybe a day or two, then maybe a week. And then I'd take a month off or 2 months. And then something would happen in my life and I would go back to it. Always going back to that. I knew what would happen when I used it. I understood that I would have the same results each time. Now, addiction's fascinating because cocaine's not the only thing I've been addicted to in my life. And I always ask this question, and here it's a little bit different, but I'm going to talk about, is there anything that you believe you can't be addicted to? People focus on the substances most of the time, and I had too. When I thought of addiction, I thought of people that used and abused substances. I grew up in a little town in Connecticut, and I can remember when we talked about people that had drug or alcohol problems, it was the wino. And I don't hear that term anymore. I haven't heard it in probably 30 or 40 years. But that was someone that drank a bottle of wine out of a little sack under the railroad tracks. Today, it's a little bit different. Today, addiction especially to opiates, as Mandy talked about in the beginning, has affected every sector, every community, every town in this country. But the substances are only a portion of the problem. The things that we can become addicted to are amazing. In fact, fascinating. One of the most common things are relationships, our addiction to people. Now, what's the difference, do you think? I'm not expecting you to answer this, but what's the difference between being addicted and dependent upon somebody or just being in a close relationship, a loving relationship? The difference is the compulsive behaviors and the obsessive thinking around the relationship and the dynamic of it. What about a belief system? Can you be addicted to an idea or a belief system? Can you be addicted to a belief about the way you think life is supposed to be and how it's supposed to be lived? And there's a right way and a wrong way to do that. Now, I've been doing family groups for, 20 years probably too. And in the addiction industry, and one of the things that families come in when they come in for a family group, they ask, I don't understand, why can't they stop using? Why can't they stop using the drug? And it seems like a simple thing to answer because people think, well, it's a brain disease and they're an addict and they're always going to be that way, and there's a language associated with this, a certain nomenclature which says, once an addict, always an addict, which is not true, by the way. In fact, it's really irrational to think about people that way. I'm not an addict today. I may have abused and been addicted to a substance at one time in my life, but I'm no more addicted, I'm no more addicted to cocaine today than I am sugar, but the truth of the matter is I probably abuse sugar more than I have used it. It's been 20-something years since I've touched cocaine, but probably sugar is one of the things that we're the most used to as far as an addiction goes in this country. Has anyone here ever detoxed off sugar? You can raise your hand. Okay. You go through withdrawals. You go through withdrawals. It can make some people very sick to take sugar out of their diet. I've done it a few times. And I always feel better afterwards, have a clearer head, think better, feel better. But it's still dealing with something that I was trying to fill up. So with belief systems, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that there's a component of this when we get caught up in the way we think that things are supposed to be when they're right or wrong. Like the life and our lives and the world and our families are supposed to be a certain way. They're all supposed to think a certain way and act a certain way. And there's a real problem associated with that, especially for adolescents. This idea and this reality that we live in today, especially when it is concerning deaths of despair. We have an epidemic here. Even this part of this valley, within a few miles of here, as Mandy had said earlier, that the problems associated with deaths of despair, which are usually, we look at that from a couple different things. Primarily suicide, but it's also intentional drug overdoses. At least in my field, that's how we look at it. And the adolescent numbers are scary. People don't feel like they're part of something, that they belong to something. Even though we grow up in an area that praises and hopes that, will follow in a certain family idea and concept, that will do things and live the right way, and that will remain connected and loyal to the family. There's belief systems in there that often cause these tragedies in young people's lives that leads them to these feelings of despair, hopelessness. And this is where the shame comes in. Now, there's a real distinction I want to talk before I go too much into shame. There's a difference between shame and guilt, and I'm not the first person that's done a TED Talk that's talked about the difference between shame and guilt. Brene Brown, for an example, she describes it, and I follow this same notion, that guilt is admitting that we made a mistake or we made a bad decision. And so we have a feeling of guilt about it, and we take accountability for it. Guilt actually is an opportunity to change. It's to do something different. We can assimilate that information that we want to do something different when we feel guilt. Shame, on the other hand, is quite toxic. In fact, when it gets internalized, we internalize, or we become to believe that we are actually the mistake. We are the identified problem. And that's where the power of shame becomes corrosive and destructive. It's not that I made a mistake, it is I am a mistake. So if I go back and say, well, why was I using cocaine? Why did that endorphin rush I got every time I used it fix those problems here and there? It didn't. It didn't fix anything. I just felt better. In fact, it made the problems worse in the long run. It made the shame worse. Nothing flows over heavier than shame. I was thinking about the first time I felt shame, and I don't remember as a little kid, but I remember being I grew up in Connecticut on the coast, and I remember being at this beach club we belonged to, and I rode my little Stingray bike down there, and I had my towel, I put it out in the sand, and I had my shorts and a t-shirt on, and I dropped my shorts down because I always wore my bathing suit underneath my shorts. And I was standing there, I looked down, and I went, oh, I don't have my bathing suit on. And in this crowded beach, and all I had on was my tighty whities. And I don't know, 6, 7 years old, maybe 8, that doesn't seem like a really big problem, but I felt shame in that moment. And I remember I just ran. I didn't pick up my shorts. I just ran to our little locker that we had there, and I closed the door and like hid in it for hours until my sister eventually came and said, what are you doing in there? I said, well, I don't have my bathing suit, and I left my shorts at the beach. Could you run over and get it for me? And I can remember that feeling of shame. Can remember it. And what's funny is that didn't come back to me until I started to do my work. This is an important component to realize, that people look at addiction, they think that the drugs are the problem. They're not. Drugs are a symptom. When I said, what can you be addicted to? We also in Utah have, I won't know if I'll call it an epidemic, we have a problem with pornography. Utah watches more pornography than just about anywhere else in the country per capita. And a lot of relationships are put into turmoil or disarray by it. But pornography, the cocaine, the alcohol, the food, the sex, the money, the greed, the work, the gambling, the smoking are all symptoms. They're not actually the problem. This is why the war on drugs doesn't work, because you can keep bashing away trying to get rid of the drugs, but you're not really getting rid of the problem. You're not really dealing with the underlying issue. And so, shame, one thing that I've noticed and one thing I've learned is everyone that comes in to, and I've been working in treatment for, as I said, 20 years. I also have a private practice. But in treatment, I've been doing group therapy for 20 years. And one thing that happens that we notice is that in common with almost everyone that walks in the door is shame. We also know that there's some level of abandonment and abuse in most people that walk in the doors as well. Then there's attachment disorders. And of course, there's post-traumatic stress, bipolar disorder, anxiety. All these things exist as well, and they need to be treated too. But across the board, shame is an underlying problem for the majority of people that walk in the door, whether they're walking into my private practice not to deal with drug addiction, or they're walking in the treatment center. If we don't deal with shame, we don't deal with their shame. If they don't deal with their shame, they will go back to some form of substance, person, place, or thing to fill that hole. Now, it's just not the guy on the beach that was standing out in his tighty whities that, created this whole story of shame. There are other things that happen. And I had an environment I grew up in that there was a lot of shame perpetuated through family, whether it be because of belief systems or unresolved grief or loss in other people's lives. But one thing I learned is that all of that is not anyone else's responsibility, it's mine. And what I mean by it's mine is those things could have happened to me, but today as an adult, I'm not the victim of those things anymore. In fact, the thing that has kept the shame and kept the problem existing is my inability to take accountability and responsibility for them. Because today, those things don't exist. Only in my head and my brain do those things exist. In fact, the story about them today is different than it was 20, 30, and 40 years ago. This is the beautiful part. It's vulnerability. It's the ability to show up and be honest and let people see the soft underside of our belly, so to speak, which most people we want to protect. We don't want people to see that vulnerable side of us. We don't want to see the fear and the pain. But if we're going to heal, if we're going to get better, if we're going to function and be able to love and be open and compassionate, we must embrace this art of vulnerability. One of the things that I teach my clients, regardless of what environment it's in, and that this stands so strongly, is that you are enough. No matter what anyone's told you, no matter how you were raised, that you are enough. There is nothing wrong with you. I have people that come in that believe that they're broken for some reason. And they have a story that they've been telling over and over again that they are. The good news is that story, believe it or not, you're the author of. And you have the ability to rewrite that story if you want to. We have that ability. We are empowered to reauthor, to edit those stories. So I believe that within each of us is that ability. And wow, it really starts with some simple things, and that's showing up. Becoming the person we can be. Whatever that is, it may change from day to day, some days being better than others, but each day we have that opportunity to be who we are. So show up and be and live the wholehearted life you were meant to. Thank you.